The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the Man from Ling. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, we are off to the art gallery to check out the work of a previously unknown artist, Sefina Rousseau, the new investigator for the Rogue class from the Path to Carcosa Deluxe expansion. Does this Polynesian painter have the artistic chops to battle the mythos? There are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing. So with that in mind, let's get started. Sefina Rousseau has 4 willpower, 2 intellect, 2 combat, and 4 agility. She has the artist trait, 5 health, and 9 sanity. She has the forced effect, when you would draw your opening hand, draw 13 cards instead. Choose up to 5 events to place beneath this card and keep 8 cards as your opening hand. Discard the rest. You cannot mulligan. Safina may take an action to choose an event beneath her and draw it. This does not provoke an attack of opportunity, and her Elder Sign effect is +3, and you may choose an event beneath her and draw it. So Sefina Rousseau is making her Arkham Horror Files debut in the Path to Carcosa, and she breaks the mold for Arkham Horror LCG investigators. I think she's easily one of the most fascinating investigators to build a deck around and play. And I think players are going to have a lot of fun figuring out how to put her artistic talents to good use against the mythos. Safina's 4 willpower and 4 agility reflect her background in forgery and the mystic arts. As with most of the investigators in the Path to Carcosa, Safina is saddled with an intellect of 2. She also has a combat of 2. Safina's low intellect and combat are a serious liability in a game in which your victory condition is contingent on your ability to discover clues and kill enemies as efficiently and effectively as possible. Now, Fantasy Flight Games has already posted a preview for Echoes of the Past, the first Mythos pack in the Path to Carcosa cycle. This takes place in the Arkham Historical Society, and the scenario pits the investigators in a desperate race for clues against a group of cultists who are conducting a search of their own. Safina's intellect of 2 isn't going to do her any favors in a race against cultists to discover clues, and killing the cultists might also be difficult depending on their stats. Here's hoping the shroud value on the locations and the combat value on the cultists in this particular scenario are low, or Safina might run into some trouble. Safina does have tools such as the flashlight, Rite of Seeking, Draw into the Flame, and Perception to help her discover clues, and I would recommend packing as many of these cards into your Safina deck as you can. With a little experience, Safina can even buy herself a set of lockpicks to explore those high shroud locations. I'd say that Safina needs to mulligan hard for these answers to her intellect deficiency. However, Safina doesn't have that option. Safina's low intellect also puts her at a disadvantage during many of the game's parlay tests. She is going to struggle to take control of Jazz Mulligan, convince innocent revelers to follow her to safety, question Constance Dumaine, or banish a poltergeist. Safina will need to find a way to boost her intellect to pass these checks, whether that's packing cards with extra intellect skill icons or brushing up on her arcane studies. Wearing fine clothes from the Where Doom Awaits Mythos pack is also a viable option if Safina needs to fall back on her powers of persuasion to advance a scenario. Safina's combat skill of 2, coupled with her health of 5, is also a serious liability. Safina is in no position to stand toe-to-toe with an enemy, so she's going to need to take them down as quickly as possible before she starts taking damage. Unfortunately, Safina has very few ways at her disposal to buff her combat value. Shriveling is really the only option available to Safina in the Mystic class until she can gain some experience, at which point she could take the Spirit Athame or Song of the Dead. Shriveling's a great spell, but it does only come with 4 charges, which will run out quickly if Safina encounters too many enemies or enemies with a lot of health. Her options in the rogue class include the 41 Derringer, the Switchblade, Backstab, and Sneak Attack. The 41 Derringer requires you to succeed by 2 to be effective, which is difficult to do with any consistency when your base combat skill is 2. I think the Switchblade is all but useless in Safina, since it also requires you to succeed by 2, but it doesn't provide you with any combat boost whatsoever. There are also the 2 neutral weapons, the knife and the kukri, neither of which are particularly good at taking down enemies quickly. I think Safina is really she looks at that the machete and the fire axe and wishes they were rogue cards. That leaves the 2 events, the Backstab and Sneak Attack. Both are expensive and lend themselves to spot removal of enemies rather than prolonged combat. Safina can certainly try to leverage her agility of 4 to evade enemies and thereby conserving her shriveling charges and backstab for any hunters that give pursuit. But I'm not sure evasion alone is going to be enough to keep Safina safe from harm. One thing is for certain, Safina will definitely need to pick her fights very carefully during a scenario. Safina's forced effect is what sets her apart from the other investigators in the game. Instead of drawing a 5-card opening hand, Safina draws 13 cards and places up to 5 events beneath her investigator card and keeps the remaining 8. All those extra cards come at a price, though. Safina cannot mulligan, so you're really going to want to construct your deck in such a way to maximize the number of events you can place beneath Safina in order to avoid discarding too many cards. So how many events do you need to include in your deck to ensure that you can place 5 beneath Safina when you would draw your opening hand? Well, if you include 16 events in your deck, you've got a 75% chance of drawing 5 of them. Now, your odds of drawing 5 only improve with each additional event you add to your deck. However, the more events you include, the fewer deck slots you have available for important assets and skills. And I think that's one of the most challenging aspects of building a Sefina Rousseau deck, is finding that right balance between the number of events, assets, and skills. Now, most of the Sefina decks I've built so far have had 16 events, and I recently pared that back to 14 in order to make room for some more assets that I felt were essential. I might even consider going as low as 12, although that would only give me about a 38% chance of drawing the 5 events, and I'm worried I might end up discarding too many cards if I go that low, and it's something I'm definitely going to need to test a little more before I'm figure out what the right number of events are for a Sefina Rousseau deck. Once you place the events beneath Sefina at the start of the game, you're going to need a way to get at them. Fortunately, the designers give you 3, although some ways are certainly better than others. The first way to get at the events beneath Sefina is take an action to draw one. Now, I really wish this was a free trigger rather than an action, since it can be challenging to find those spare actions, especially when you play as much solo as I do. Now, at least that action doesn't provoke an attack of opportunity. And I've really got to hand it to the designers on this one. In my experience playing Sefina so far, knowing the right time to draw one of those events from beneath her, it can be quite challenging. And I think that might turn out to be one of the things that differentiates a good Sefina player from a mediocre one. You can also use Sefina's Elder Sign effect to draw an event from beneath Sefina. Pulling an Elder Sign gives a Sefina +3 bonus on her skill check, which is strong compared to what the other investigators get. However, as with all Elder Sign effects, you really can't count on pulling an Elder Sign from the notorious fickle Chaos bag when you need one. It is a really nice bonus if you get to choose and draw an event, but if you really need one of the cards beneath Sefina, you are much better taking an action to draw it. The third way to use the cards beneath Sefina is with her signature event, the Painted World, which we'll take a look at after considering Sefina's deck building restrictions. Sefina is similar to the Investigators from the core set in that her deck includes cards from a primary class and a secondary class, in this case Rogue and Mystic. She can include Rogue cards level 0, 1 to 5, neutral cards level 0, 1 to 5, and Mystic cards level 0 to 2. Sefina has a deck size of 33, which is slightly larger than the norm of 30. By the time you add her signature cards and a basic weakness, Sefina's deck balloons to 38 cards. I think it's important to note here that while Sefina basically starts with a hand of 13 cards, card draw is a rare commodity in the Rogue and Mystic classes. Besides the draw granted by the neutral skill cards in the core set, the Arcane Initiate and Pickpocketing are really your only options, and both come with limitations. If you don't see a card in your opening hand, you're going to need to dig for it the old-fashioned way, which really isn't ideal if you're missing a key piece of your strategy. Now, events are the backbone of a Sefina Rousseau deck, and there are 17 level 0 events to choose from in the Rogue, Mystic, and Neutral classes. And they range from powerhouses like Emergency Cache and Drawn to the Flame, all the way down to duds like our friend Contraband from the Dunwich Legacy expansion. There are roughly 5 events, 5 of those 17 events that I think will find a home in most Sefina decks, and those would be Delve Too Deep, Drawn to the Flame, Elusive, Emergency Cache, and Ward of Protection. Now, I realize that Delve Too Deep is probably the most controversial pick of the bunch. I wasn't a big fan of this card when it was released in the Miskatonic Museum Mythos pack, because I really didn't like the idea of tempting fate by drawing extra cards from the encounter deck. However, I have really warmed up to it, especially if you can play it right before you resign. Those extra victory points that you gain can really add up over the course of a campaign, and it's great to have the option to snipe an extra victory point here and there in a deck that can struggle to take down enemies. Now, if you're playing a Sefina build that leans heavily on the Mystic spells, such as Shriveling and Rite of Seeking, I'd include Uncage the Soul on that list of essential events. The rest of the Mystic events are a bit of a mixed bag. I'm not a fan of Astral Travel, since Sefina can already take Elusive from the Rogue class, which I think is superior. If you're going to go all in on Evasion, Blinding Light might be worth a look, although Sefina's Willpower and Agility are the same value. It doesn't make much sense to me to pay the extra resources for an Evasion check if you don't have to. Hypnotic Gaze might be useful if the Evasion plan falls through, although it is quite expensive at 3 resources, and to play that repeatedly would really drain your resource pool. If you're playing the Arcane Initiate or Alyssa Graham, you might consider running Moonlight Ritual to remove any extra doom that you add in play. If your Sefina build is leaning more heavily on the Rogue card pool, I'd include Backstab on that list of essential events. It's one of Sefina's few combat options, although once again it is quite expensive at 3 resources. I think Sleight of Hand is a great addition if you're playing lots of items like flashlights and weapons, while Sneak Attack makes a lot of sense if you're planning to evade enemies. Daring Maneuver might make the cut if you're playing around with the Succeed by 2 mechanic in Sefina, although I'm not sure that's particularly viable considering her combat is so low. I'm Out of Here always has its uses. You could certainly play it instead of Manual Dexterity in your deck, although Manual Dexterity does have the potential to draw you a card, which is good in a deck that lacks really any other source of draw. And there's also Think on Your Feet, which can help Safina avoid enemies while moving around the map a little quicker. Either way you go, I think once you throw in a couple copies of the essential events, such as Emergency Cache, and a handful of the others depending on your build, you should have enough events in your deck to draw 5 of them reliably at the beginning of the game. Now, Sefina Rousseau's signature cards include 3 copies of an event, the Painted World, and a treachery, the Stars of Hyades. The Painted World is a spell with willpower, agility, and wild skill icons. And unlike the other events included in a Sefina Rousseau deck, it cannot be placed beneath Sefina Rousseau at the start of the game. And it has the game text, play the Painted World as an exact copy of a non-exceptional event that is beneath Sefina Rousseau. Remove the Painted World from the game instead of discarding it. Now, I think the Painted World is a pretty amazing card. As long as you've got an event beneath Safina, it's like you've got 3 extra copies of it floating around in your deck. There are so many possible ways to use and abuse this card that it's really impossible to list them all here. You just have to imagine starting your campaign with 3 extra copies of Emergency Cache, Drawn to the Flame, or Ward of Protection in your deck, and you can really get a sense of just how powerful the Painted World can be. Resource generation, discovering clues, and canceling treachery cards are all good, so having those copies of Painted World to do that repeatedly would be really awesome. Things can get even better once Safina has a few experience points under her belt. The non-exceptional clause prevents you from playing Ace in the Hole multiple times to gain a whole lot of actions, but you could copy the two of the rogue class's most powerful events, Sure Gamble and Hot Streak. Between Emergency Cache and Hot Streak, Safina could become easily become one of the wealthiest investigators in the game. All those extra resources would certainly come in handy, since the resource cost of many of the cards in a Safina deck is quite high. The Painted World will only get better as more Rogue and Mystic events are released. It's even got a great spread of skill icons in case you need to pitch it to a test. And it's a spell, so remember that you can search for it with an Arcane Initiate. Now, there are a couple of important things to note about the Painted World. One, the Painted World is treated as an exact copy of the event, so you do still need to pay the resource cost for that event. And you can reduce the cost of playing that event with Uncage the Soul, but only if it's a spell. And the final thing you really need to keep in mind is that you can't play the Painted World to copy Delve Too Deep. Well, you could, but the only thing it will do is draw you an extra encounter card. Once you place the Painted World into your victory display, it's treated as the Painted World, so there'll be no victory points for you. Safina's signature weakness is the Stars of Hyades. It's a curse with the following game text. Revelation, randomly choose an event beneath Sefina Rousseau and remove it from the game. If you cannot, take 1 damage and 1 horror. If your deck has 5 or more cards in it, shuffle the Stars of Hyades back into your deck instead of discarding it. So after playing close to a dozen games with the Safina, I think it's safe to say that the Stars of Hyades is one of the least harmful weaknesses in the game. It certainly pales in comparison to the King in Yellow, which I reviewed during the Minte Fan deck tech. The Stars of Hyades doesn't tax your actions like Cover Up, Searching for Izzy, Smite the Wicked, or Racked by Nightmares. And it doesn't force you to jump through any hoops to get rid of it, like Hospital Debts or the King in Yellow Act 1. The Stars of Hyades also gives you a measure of control over whether it will tag Safina with damage or horror, since you're the one who ultimately decides whether to draw the events from beneath Safina. If you draw the Stars of Hyades early, it's pretty unlikely to do any damage and horror to Safina, since you should have some events beneath her. And even if you draw it late, the chance that the Stars of Hyades will hurt Safina seems relatively low. In all the games I've played with Safina so far, I've never been able to draw all of the events beneath her, so I've always had cards to remove from the game when the Stars of Hyades popped. Now, Stars of Hyades is similar to Rex Murphy's weakness, Rex's Curse, in that it gets shuffled back into your deck after it resolves. I can certainly see situations where this could cause a problem if you're close to decking yourself. For example, you could draw the Stars of Hyades multiple times in quick succession. It hasn't happened to me, but the potential is certainly there, and it might even kill you if you're running low on health, although that possibility of that happening seems fairly remote. Generally speaking, when I'm evaluating the weaknesses in this game, I'm asking myself three questions. One, will it kill me? Two, could it cost me the game if I draw it at the wrong time? And three, will it tag me with mental or physical trauma unless I get rid of it? And I have to say that Stars of Hyades hasn't even come close to killing me, and it certainly hasn't cost me any games so far. So I really wouldn't worry too much about it unless you're starting to run low on deck, or maybe if you're playing some of those scenarios from the Dunwich Legacy cycle where you are discarding a lot of cards from your deck and you haven't seen the Stars of Hyades yet. So what does a Sefina Rousseau deck look like? Well, I think there are quite a few different ways you could go with the deck, depending on the events you decide to include. The deck I've included is by no means a definitive build. It's just simply one of several I've been testing in solo play so far, and I'll discuss the results of that in a moment. The deck includes 2 copies each of Rite of Seeking, Arcane Studies drawn to the Flame, Perception, and Unexpected Courage to shore up Sefina Rousseau's investigation. Rite of Seeking and Drawn to the Flame, Perception, and Unexpected Courage are usually sufficient, but I found that sometimes Safina can really use that little extra boost that you can get with Arcane Studies. The combat package is a little lighter than I would like it to be, with only 2 copies of Shriveling and 2 copies of Backstab. You can use the Painted World to play Backstab multiple times if necessary, but that gets pretty expensive pretty fast. The original version of this deck also included 2 copies of Sneak Attack, but I found it sort of difficult to play because you do need to evade the enemy first before you can take an action to damage it with Sneak Attack. I've found that Think on Your Feet and Elusive are a little better in the long run because both are a great way to avoid unnecessary fights while advancing your board state. That said, Safina is no monster in combat, so you really need to tread carefully and really pick your battles. The Holy Rosary improves Safina's odds of success with Rite of Seeking and Shriveling, and it also has a nice little pool of sanity there, while Leo DeLuca's extra action is amazing if you can get him down on the table. You might consider replacing Leo with Alyssa Graham, who does provide a passive boost to Safina's intellect, and also lets her avoid dangerous cards in the encounter deck for the cost of a Doom. Safina can use the Painted World to play Emergency Cache multiple times to generate the resources she needs to play some of her more expensive cards, such as Leo, Backstab, and the Rite of Seeking. The copy of Lone Wolf is in there also to generate the extra resources you need, because Safina's cards do tend to be on the expensive side. There are a few surprises in the events package. Obviously, it's great if you can play Uncage the Soul to play Shriveling for free, or Rite of Seeking for 1 resource. Delve Too Deep was in the original build, but I've removed it from this one in favor of Think on Your Feet in order to shore up Safina's enemy management. I think the skill package here is fairly self-explanatory. Safina needs to pass a lot of willpower skill tests, so Guts is always a welcome sight in your hand. And manual dexterity helps Safina pass those evasion checks, and can also come in handy if you need to boost your agility value for the backstab skill test. And of course, there's perception and unexpected courage. I've also been testing a control build that uses Alyssa Graham and scrying to manipulate the encounter deck. If you can get Alyssa and a copy of scrying down early, you can exert a great deal of control over which cards you draw during the Mythos phase. They say knowledge is power, and you can use that information to set up a lot of interesting plays that you couldn't do otherwise. During a recent game against Curtain Call, for example, I knew there was an enemy on top of the deck, so I moved to one of the backstage locations, grabbed a clue there, and waited for the enemy to arrive. Then I played Think on Your Feet to return to the backstage, which basically stranded the enemy in a location that I had no intention of visiting again. I was able to pull off the same trick later against another enemy, and I also used Alyssa's ability to bury one enemy at the bottom of the encounter deck before it could wreck me. Alyssa Graham also comes with the added bonus of boosting Safina's intellect. Now, I'm not particularly sold on the copy of Moonlight Ritual I included in the deck, since I rarely do use Alyssa's ability to bury a card. If you've got scrying out, you can arrange the cards in such a way that you can bury a card right before the agenda advances. That is, of course, if the encounter deck doesn't reshuffle on you. So what's it like to play a Sefina Rousseau deck? Well, I'm afraid I've got some good news and I've got some bad news. We're going to start with the good news. First off, it's absolutely amazing to draw a starting hand of 13 cards. There's nothing quite like starting off with a mitt full of cards, and I'm always blown away by the options and possible lines of play that are open to me from the get-go when I'm playing Safina. Secondly, Safina is a lot of fun to play because there are so many decision points during the game. The first and perhaps the most difficult comes the moment you draw your opening hand, because you need to choose which of those events you're going to stash under Safina and which events you're going to hold in your opening hand. There are a lot of factors to consider when you're making that decision. Am I planning to duplicate this event with the Painted World? Do I need to focus on investigation, combat, or both? Is this event safer in my hand than under Safina? Can I afford to lose this event to the Stars of Hyades? And during the game, you're constantly reevaluating those decisions. Do I copy Drawn to the Flame with the Painted World to grab this clue now, or do I need to hang on to the Painted World in case I need to play an elusive or Ward of Protection later? Do I draw the Uncage the Soul under Safina so I can commit it to a critical willpower test? Or do I wait to see if I draw my Right of Seeking so I can reduce the cost to put it in play? Personally, I really enjoy that style of play with all those decisions, but I know there are going to be some players out there who are turned off by it. If you're looking for an investigator who will basically run on autopilot for you, you're probably going to want to take a pass on Safina. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if Safina has a higher skill cap to play than some of the other investigators in the game. Judging by my win-loss record, I'm not nearly skilled enough yet to play Safina well. And unfortunately, that brings me to the bad news. I have been playing a lot of Safina lately, and I'm sad to report that, at least in solo, she's not quite ready for her own exhibit. Now, that might have something to do with the fact that I've been testing Safina against Curtain Call, the first scenario in the Path to Carcosa cycle. Now, I'm not going to spoil that scenario here, but I think it's fair to say that it's very challenging if you're playing in solo. I've beaten it with a few of the other investigators in the Path to Carcosa box, but not Safina. In fact, I don't think I've even been close to beating it with her. And really, that worries me a little, considering it is the first scenario of a campaign. Now, I do understand that not every investigator needs to be a superstar in solo or multiplayer. I'm simply concerned that a player who may be new to the game is going to pick up the Path to Carcosa, sleeve up a Safina deck, and then just proceed to get crushed a few times. And then they're just going to bury the cards deep in their closet, never to see the light of day again. If I had to come up with a word to describe Safina, I think fragile is the one that immediately comes to mind. And I think that probably has a lot to do with the fact that Safina has intellect and combat values of 2. It's going to be difficult to succeed at this game when you're not very good at investigating or fighting, both of which are 2 of the main pillars of the game. And unlike some investigators, Safina really can't take intellect or combat tests for granted. More often than not, she's going to need to commit a lot of cards and or resources to pass either of those tests. And if she fails one of those tests, it's really like getting punched in the gut by Cthulhu. And once Safina gets winded, it can be really difficult for her to recover. I think if you'd asked me to identify Safina's Achilles heel before I played her, I probably would have said intellect. But it turns out intellect isn't such a problem. I mean, I think she's got enough tools in order to pass those intellect checks. The combat, on the other hand, is a much graver threat to Safina's well-being. Safina simply doesn't have many good options to take on the agents of the mythos besides shriveling and backstab. If you don't see your shriveling or you run out of charges, you're kind of hooped. And backstab works fine as a backup until you run into an enemy with 4 health. Sure, you can hit it for 3 damage, but what are you going to do for an encore? And the answer, I'm afraid, usually isn't very pretty. Sometimes I've played my backstab, I've done the 3 damage, and then I've just sat there because I don't have anything else I can do. Now, I've toyed with the idea of playing the 41 caliber Derringer or adding a double or nothing to the deck to help boost backstab, but those really feel like band-aid solutions for the gaping flesh wound that is Safina's combat. Now, I do think the situation improves a lot once Safina gains a few experience, because suddenly you have access to the Spirit Athame and Song of the Dead, and some of those other, I know there's some, I mean, the Chicago Typewriter even would be awesome. It's just getting to that point intact that's the big problem. Now, I have had some success playing around with evasion in Safina to limit the number of fights that she has to get into, but that really only gets you so far. Once a hunter or 2 turns up, it's only a matter of time before you start taking damage, whether that's because you're failing the evasion checks or the hunters are just moving into your location and hitting you. And Safina really doesn't have the health to take many hits before she gets into trouble. The other thing that I found kind of surprising is that the mulligan restriction on her can really come back to bite her pretty hard. There are going to be hands that you draw that you're going to want to mulligan because you didn't draw a way to boost your intellect, or you're missing, you didn't draw a shriveling or a backstab so you can get into combat, or maybe you didn't draw any of your emergency resources that you would hope to play to give you that resource boost to play some of Safina's more expensive assets. And unfortunately, I mean, you're stuck. You can't mulligan, so you've got to play with what you've got. And really at that point, your only option is to try to drop for answers. And frankly, sometimes those answers just don't come in time. And chances are you'll start to fall behind the agenda deck, and you'll just dig yourself too deep a hole, and you won't be able to make a comeback. And that's a little frustrating, to be stuck with the hand and not being able to get rid of it. So, I have to admit that playing Safina has been a bit of a frustrating experience, to say the least. I can really see the potential there, but I think she's just a few cards shy of true greatness. Again, I'm speaking purely from the perspective of a solo player, and I'd be very curious to hear how she fares in multiplayer. I would be worried though, about her intellect and combat. But if she does have some other investigators with, if she's with a seeker or a guardian who can handle that, I think Safina would perform a lot better. So that's going to do it for my review of Sefina Rousseau. Despite my frustrating win-loss record, I've really enjoyed playing Safina since the Path to Carcosa, because she forces me to make so many decisions during the game, and I really enjoy that aspect of playing her. Unfortunately, the more decisions you make, the greater the chance you make a wrong one. And Safina is really not that very forgiving when it comes to making mistakes. Often I can look back on the games I've played and I can point out, okay, I took that event, or I didn't play the painted world at the right time, or I used this event for a skill test rather than playing it, and I can usually point to that and say, well, that's where things started to go wrong. And that's a little unfortunate. I hope she gets it'd be nice if she got a little bit more of a boost to her, some way of boosting her up so she didn't seem so fragile if she fails some of those tests. So if you really enjoy making decisions during a game and really having to pay attention to what your investigator is doing, I'd highly recommend that you give Safina a try. I'm really looking forward to seeing how she evolves more as more cards are released during the upcoming cycle. That's going to do it for me today. If you enjoyed this episode, I would appreciate it if you could give me a thumbs up or rate it on iTunes. It helps out the channel a great deal. What's your experience been with Safina? I'd be really curious to hear how she's been doing in multiplayer and solo. You can leave me a comment down below. I always like to hear from what you guys have to say. Make sure you hit that subscribe button to be notified of when I release future episodes. We've got a couple more investigators who are going to be coming up here shortly, Akachi and William York. I'm also going to start doing my playthroughs for the Path to Carcosa cycle. I see that Echoes of the Past is due out in 2 weeks, so we should get some of those playthroughs down so we can get these campaigns started. If you'd like to contact me, I can be reached at manfromlang@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromlang. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.